John, which war did you serve in?
The Vietnam conflict.
And which branch of the service?
United States Army. I was drafted.
What was your highest rank?
Sergeant E5.
And in which general locations did you serve?
I was with the 9th Infantry Division, primarily in the Mekong Delta, south of the demilitarized zone in the Republic of South Vietnam.
All right, so tell me, John, how you were drafted. Where were you living at that time?
East Canaan, Connecticut.
Were you prepared to be drafted?
Yeah, I was prepared to be drafted. I was not looking forward to it, but it was inevitable because the Vietnam conflict was heating up in 1966, and I knew that I was eligible. And many of my friends in the area had gotten drafted, so, we all chatted with each other and, who's next sort of thing. There were very, very few people in our area who were draft eligible that were not drafted. Almost all of my friends were drafted.
Do you recall the date?
November 28, 1966. Remember it well. I had to be in Torrington, Connecticut on the courthouse steps at 6 a.m.
Once you were drafted, how long did you have before you actually headed out to boot camp?
It was funny the way things happened. There was about 75 of us on the steps of the town hall in Torrington. Ironically, I didn't know anybody that was there. There was nobody from Canaan or East Canaan that was asked to report on that specific day. There were a lot of people there from Torrington. And you know how it is, you buddy up with people. And from the get-go that morning, early in the morning, I met up with two Torrington natives, Jimmy Navolo and Jerry Roberts. And we became instant friends, and we went through basic training at Fort Knox together and advanced infantry training together.
So that was your induction service. Did you leave immediately for basic training?
We left. We were there for about an hour or so, and we were put on a bus. There were two buses. My recollection is there was about 75 of us, and we were in two chartered buses, and we were transported to New Haven. And that's actually where we were inducted. And that was quite an experience because the Army professionals were there, the people that induct you, and the thing I remember vividly is a lot of hollering. They're hollering at you, and they need you to understand their culture immediately. So that's what they're doing, and I learned later on, much later on, that it's important to do that because in a combat situation, it's got to be a reflex action. And you have to understand and know your role. So they start early, even before you're inducted.
Wow. Where did you go from New Haven?
We were put on a bus and taken to Bradley Field, and we flew to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, which was where I was supposed to go to basic training. But we were there, and the basic training program was overwhelmed, and they couldn't fit our group of 75 into a company. We were there for 5 days. I remember it was very, very cold, and we were in tents, and there were coal stoves in the tents, and we were 5 to a tent. And that was quite an interesting experience. It was quite cold, especially at night. It got down near freezing, and we had a lot of rain. Finally, the camp commander and others decided that we were not going to be able to go to basic training at Fort Knox or at Fort Jackson. And a number of us were sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky, including Jimmy and Jerry. So the three of us were shipped off to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And that's where we went through basic training and advanced infantry
You
training.
didn't stay at Fort Jackson?
5 days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So at Fort Knox, that's where you completed your basic training?
That's correct.
How long was that?
My recollection is it was 8 weeks. And my DD-214 would show that, and I will locate that and get that to you. It was, I believe, 8 weeks, 7, 8 weeks.
What was basic training like?
Intense. I was 19 years old, and you have I was 5'8", 150 pounds. And you have these drill sergeants who they seem huge. Most of them were 200, 250 pounds, and they're barking orders at you. And you didn't speak unless you were spoken to. And you learned that in a hurry. And it seemed every time you turned around, they had you dropping and doing 20 push-ups. Because you didn't do something properly, or you didn't do something fast enough, or you were too quick to do something, and it was a very humbling experience. But again, you had your buddies, and that's how you got through it, because you learned early on to listen carefully, follow orders, and quite frankly, if you did that, that was a piece of cake.
Now, you stayed with your friends Jimmy and Jerry?
Yes.
That?
Yes. Yep. We were together the whole time, and of course, we picked up some other buddies. They had other friends from Torrington because they were Torrington natives. I remember Marty Van Buren from Torrington, and there were others. But they knew them well. I just became friendly with them in basic training.
Where did you go after basic training?
I was very fortunate. I had quite a bit of training. I went to radio school. That was at Fort Knox, Kentucky as well. That was in another area of the fort. It was interesting because Fort Knox was the Armor Training Center. And I was so hoping I would qualify to be in a tank. But that was not to be. And the Army's needs at the time were for radio operators. And my specific MOS was 05C20. Which meant I carried a radio on my back, and I was with the platoon leader or company commander in a field of combat. And those folks were being lost rapidly in the Republic of Vietnam at the time. And so there was a combination of the Army's needs and my aptitude, so I was selected for that type of training. And I went through that training and successfully completed that training. And then I was selected for radio teletype training, which the MOS was 05C40. And that's a step up. And generally, the radio teletype operators were in a headquarters situation, and they were reporting information from the combat field to company headquarters or brigade headquarters or division headquarters in some cases. Actually, in my case, in a combat situation, I was in Dong Tam, Vietnam. Our field base camp was called Bearcat, and I was reporting to division. And most of our duty time was in the evening at dark.
That was as a teletype operator?
That was as a radio teletype operator when I was in South Vietnam, yes.
So when you got your radio training, were you ever a radio operator in the field?
Yes, I was, but just as a secondary MOS in situations that were needed. Very little of that, maybe a half a dozen times, where I was sent out in the field. Basically, there was a platoon of us, about 20 of us, that were sent out in the field, and I had to be one of the radio operators because The regular operator wasn't there. My main MOS was 05C40 radio teletype, but it was more critical at the time for the radio operator. But fortunately, I was only out, I would say, a half a dozen times. But it was a combat situation all of those times, and it was, you grow up in a hurry.
Now, you did your teletype training also at Fort Knox?
Yes.
Where did you go after that?
Well, that could have been Fort Gordon. I was in Fort Gordon, and the information that I've given you will document that.
Okay.
That training may have been in Fort Gordon, Georgia, because I did have one or the other in Fort Gordon. And perhaps I'm hazy on that. I just don't recall.
We could check, but one of them was at Fort Gordon.
And one was at Fort Knox, that's correct.
So after both of those trainings, where did you go?
Then I went to Fort Rucker, Alabama.
For what?
Non-Commissioned Officers Academy.
Was that your choice?
No. But I qualified for it, and I was asked if I wanted to go, and I said, you have me for 2 years, 24 months, and I'm not sure that I really want to do this, but if it's what I'm qualified to do and it's what you want me to do, I'll do it. And what happens if I tell you I don't want to do it? And they said, you're going anyway. So it must be that, again, they needed individuals, and I qualified or had the aptitude at the time, so I was selected and I went.
What was that training like?
That was quite intense because that was a step up from anything I had experienced previously. The other training I had was, I thought of it as general training because everybody goes in, and if you don't enlist after you're drafted, then you go to training in a general level, especially as an enlisted man. And there really aren't a lot of options, and you just do what you're told and go through the training. And then when there's a conflict or it's war, you're off to war in most cases. I went to the Non-Commissioned Officers Academy and successfully completed the program and was told that most likely I was going to stay at Fort Knox and be a trainer for other folks that were selected for the school. That didn't happen. I stayed there about a week after graduation, and then I got orders for Vietnam. So I came home. I was given a 30-day leave. I came home November 1st or November 2nd, and then I was home until November 27th or 28th of 1967. Yeah.
Where did you land when you got to Vietnam?
Benoit.
What was your first impression?
I was scared to death. We were prepared. We went to a week or two of advanced infantry training upon receiving our orders for Vietnam before we were sent home on leave. And that's where we learned about booby traps and mines. And we actually experienced live fire in a training situation, so we knew what to expect. When we left and we were flying into Vietnam, we were told to have our M16s locked and loaded before we got off the plane. So you got the impression that it was a serious situation and you need to pay attention and alert. And we were in a big carrier, I think it's a CH-130. It emptied from the rear. And I mean, it was big enough that you could drive a Jeep or a 3/4 ton pickup truck through the rear. That's how big it was. So it was a very big plane. But we were troop carriers, and we were not seated in regular seats. We were seated on the floor of the cargo plane, and we landed. And I remember vividly getting out of the plane, and I heard shots, and you know, your first reaction is to get low to the ground. And there actually was an attempt as we landed to overrun the base. And so we had live fire. That was my indoctrination to the Republic of South Vietnam, getting off the plane, and we were being fired at. And we were told, this is not a test, this is live situation, it's the Viet Cong, they're trying to overrun us. So it was just one of those situations, and fortunately, no one was injured, no one was hurt. The troops that were there to secure the base were able to contain everything, and it turned out for me to be a non-issue. But you realize in a hurry that this is the real deal. This is a combat situation. You may not come home. You realize that, and I remember that. You know, that sunk in, and at the time, I was 20 years old, and you grow up. You grow up really rapidly, and you mature. You mature quickly.
Did you stay at the Benoit base?
No, we were immediately after things quieted down, and they had a very brief indoctrination process. I was supposed to go to a headquarters company and be in a military intelligence unit. I was sequestered along with some other folks, and I learned that I think there were 3 or 4 of us. We were all supposed to go to this military intelligence company. We were told, you're not going to military intelligence. We need you out in the field. You've been reassigned to headquarters company, 1st Brigade, 9th Infantry Division. And so you do what you're told. And in a very short time, they came for us in a deuce and a half, which is a big heavy-duty truck. It was a 6-wheeler, dual wheels on the back, and there was about 20 of us, and there was room for 10 on each side of the truck, seated on wooden platforms, and we were taken to the field, and I ended up in Dong Tam. That was the city of Dong Tam, but we were in a field situation. I mean, there were no buildings like you see out here. It was tents. It was tent city. It was a combat situation, and the name of that field was Bearcat. And I was in Bearcat the whole 12 months that I was in Vietnam, wow. Except for when I was actually out in combat situations.
Now, because now they've reassigned you and you're not there what you thought you were going to be there for, what was your job when you were assigned to Bearcat Field? Were you going to be a radio operator?
Radio teletype.
So you were still going to be the teletype?
Yep.
And is that what you were?
Yes.
So what was it like, you know, what was a typical day for you as a teletype operator?
A typical day, during the day, most of the time we slept because we were up all night. There was about a dozen radio teletype operators in the company. And our company had, I think, 220 men. And you know, there were straight leg infantry. There were a number of MOSs in the company. There was about a dozen of us that had the 05C40 qualifications. And we took turns. In the photos I've left you, there's a picture, at least one, maybe several, of the command headquarters for the radio teletype. It's not what you would imagine. It was very crude. It was basically a tent with wooden sides, and you know, all our electronic gear was inside. We had sandbags around it because you know, we could be overrun at any time. We were out in the field, and that's where I worked mostly at night. Mostly started at dusk, and we worked until dawn. And it was every day. I mean, you know, it wasn't none of this coffee break stuff or anything like that. You're in a combat situation. You were there. You had your M16 with you all the time. Some of us had pistols, and you could be overrun. And indeed, we were overrun several times. But again, there were very, very few casualties. I was fortunate. I consider myself one of the few fortunate folks that served in the United States Army because I came home unscarred. I had no physical scars and I had no mental scars. And many of my friends came home and they had either or, and several of them had both. So I consider myself very fortunate.
As a teletape operator, what kinds of information were you relaying and from whom to whom?
We were primarily relaying information. We were brigade headquarters. So we were getting information from the field, the combat infantrymen in the field, and were basically KIAs, killed in action, which we were reporting. We were brigade headquarters. We were reporting to division. And that was a daily routine. And, you know, sometimes there was very little action. But shortly after I got there, in November of '67, the Tet Offensive started early in the year 1968. That was the hottest time of the Vietnam conflict. And it was very, very hot. And it was not unusual. Some nights there would be three-figure KIAs, over 100. It was hot. It was a hot time, and that wasn't just, you know, the KIAs for all of Vietnam. That was the KIAs for the 9th Infantry Division. So when there were, I don't know how many other divisions that were there, but there were certainly more than the 9th Infantry.
So describe what it was like when your base was overrun or what they were attempting to overrun. So how would that be different?
Well, you were very alert because, first of all, in many cases, until they were right up to the perimeter, you didn't know what was happening. You had guard duty at night. And a few of us with the 05C40 MOS would rotate through guard duty. And guard duty, you were on the perimeter, and there, again, there's pictures, and it's heavily sandbagged. We had armor in some cases, and we had mines out front. So hopefully, if anybody was trying to infiltrate, they would trip the mines. We would hear, we would see the flash, and we would know, but that didn't always happen. Sometimes they could get through, and you wouldn't know until they were virtually 10 feet in front of you that somebody was there. Again, you're in a jungle setting. We were in a base camp, and our base camp was clear, but when you're on the perimeter, it's jungle, or it's woods, or wherever you may be. We had an interesting situation at Bearcat because we were in the Delta. We were very close to the Mekong River, and we had the river rats attached to our unit. So they were very interesting, and, you know, we would see them. That most of the time they would go out at night. We'd be working at night, and then, you know, we'd be rotating through in the morning, and they would be coming in, and we'd be going off duty, and we'd be going in for breakfast or whatever. So we mingled with them. We'd have breakfast together, and they had some really interesting stories. They saw a lot of action. The river rats, the riverine force. They were the real deal. They were the combat infantry people. Anybody that earns a combat infantry badge, they are the real deal. They are not handed out cavalierly. You must see combat to earn a CIB badge.
Now, you said that there were some times where you went out as the radio operator. So
Right.
This was while you were at Bearcat?
Yes.
Can you describe one or two of those missions?
Yes, basically, I was with the company commander, and we had a Jeep, a a Jeep that would hold 4 people, but we only had, I was driving and the company commander was seated next to me, and we had radio equipment in the back seat where people could sit. And we would go out in remote areas and erect a tower, and because and at that point we would be communicating with brigade headquarters, and we would be getting data from the field, and we would go out and set up the radio towers, and then we would just sit right close to the radio tower out there with very little protection, and there was maybe a half a dozen of us, and that was all there was. We were out there on our own. And fortunately, I was pretty much incident free of all of those events. There was one time, however, and there are a couple of interesting experiences that I was involved in when I was in the field in a combat situations, and I was very fortunate. There are 2 specific times that come to mind, and I think of them frequently. The first situation, I was green. I had been there about 2 months, and it was March, and we were in the height of the Tet offensive. And we had gone out, and the company commander said to me, I'm going to send you back. There's a helicopter coming in here, and I'm going to send you back. They're bringing in someone else, and I'm going to send you back to base camp. You're going to probably be there a day or 2. And I said, well, how come? And he said, well, it's just what we're going to do. We've been here for a while, and you need a break. So I'm sending you back. And I never knew why. Because I was no better, no worse than anybody else. I didn't need a break any more than my buddies needed a break. But for some reason, I was sent back. Another person was coming out. And that night, the group got overrun. And one of my buddies was killed. Now, that could have been me. I don't know. You often say, why did this happen? Well, that was one event. Another event... and this was shortly before my time was up. We were in the Jeep with the company commander. I was not driving. I was in the back seat with a man from Buffalo, New York, buddy of mine, Joe Volkevich. He was also a radio teletype operator. And we were on our way to Saigon. I don't recall the particulars, but we were on our way to Saigon. And on our way, a sniper shot Joe Volkevich. Now, we were seated side by side. Our shoulders were rubbing together because it's a Jeep and it's very small area that we were seated in. Assuming the sniper was shooting at the company commander, but we don't know. He ended up shooting Joe Volkevich, and he was wounded seriously and medevaced out. He was medevaced out of Vietnam, and I never saw him again. And I often think of Joe, and I was never able to locate him.
How do you spell his last name, John?
I would have to look it up. I believe it's Wolkivich. He was from Buffalo, New York. I remember that well because it's not that far away from Sharon, Connecticut. And he was a good guy. He was a heavy-set fella and a great sense of humor. And we were pretty good buds. But I often think of Joe and wonder about him. And I've been to the Vietnam Wall. I did not see his name on the wall, but he was wounded, and wounded seriously enough that he was medevaced out of the country. So I always wondered what happened to him, and I've never been able to locate him.
Now, when you did go out on these missions and you were the driver for the company commander and the radio operator, what radio were you using?
Oh, I don't recall. When we were in the Jeep, we had the radios on the back mast. I had one on the left side and one on the right side. I don't remember the nomenclature. They were just big, cumbersome radios, and they were on the Jeep mast, solidly positioned. They were different from the radio that I would carry on my back when you're in a combat situation. That is very light. At the time had a telephone that looks very much like an old telephone, and you cranked it and you were talking. So a completely different type of radio. The radios on the Jeep were radios that you would use to communicate. They're FM radios. They were line of sight radios. So you would use those to communicate generally longer distances and from a higher vantage point, because you had to have a clear line of sight.
When you were on base, well, first of all, how big was the Bearcat base?
It seemed huge. I don't know. I've got some pictures that show when we were hit by mortars, and there's one picture there of a huge fire where 4 or 5 barracks were burnt down as a result of mortar coming in late at night. I honestly don't know how big it was, but it was pretty good size. It was the size of a small town. There were a lot of people, and as I said, we had the River Rats attached to our unit, and they were a group. My recollection is about 75 or 100. So there were quite a few people there, but I would hesitate to give you a number because I really don't know.
Were there casualties in your unit?
There were people who were wounded, but there were no KIAs that I am aware of. I'm sure that there were straight leg infantrymen who were killed, but I wouldn't necessarily know them because they had different MOSs, and I was in the Signal Corps, so I was surrounded with people who had Signal Corps MOSs.
John, you said there were about a dozen teletype operators.
Right.
Did you teletype operators all live together?
Yes,
So you were.
we did. Yes, we did. We all lived together. Yeah.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
I was awarded the Army Commendation Medal for meritorious service in the Republic of Vietnam. And I was surprised to receive that, but I believe everyone that served in Vietnam was awarded that medal.
Did you sustain any injuries?
I did not sustain any injuries. I was very fortunate.
John, I'm going to ask you a few questions about daily life and what it was like. While you were in South Vietnam, how did you stay in touch with your family?
You wrote letters. That was really the mode of communication. There was no internet. There was no communication. I mean, you couldn't pick up the phone and call home. It didn't happen. Now, being in the Signal Corps, and there's a piece in that material I've given you that was in the local paper at the time. I was able, at one time when I was on the radio, to locate a shortwave radio operator in Arizona who was able to patch me through to my mother in East Canaan, Connecticut at the time. That was just a stroke of luck, a fluke of luck, because I was a radio operator and was fooling around and just located this guy in Arizona who was able to pick me up, and we got talking, and he said, I can get through to East Canaan, no problem, I can. And next thing I know, the phone's ringing and I hear my mother pick up the phone. And there's a piece in the paper about it that says, John Perotti, serving in South Vietnam, telephoned his mother, telephone patch. We received notice that she spoke with him the other day, and he went over there in November of '67 and is scheduled to come home in November of '68. Just a brief blurb.
She must have been pretty surprised.
Yes, yeah. I was surprised. And that little blurb is something that she kept on a kitchen cabinet in her kitchen, and it's something that Shirley, my wife, and I keep on a kitchen cabinet in plain sight in our kitchen today.
Were you a good letter writer? Did you write often?
You'd have to ask my wife, Shirley. I did. I wrote frequently to Shirley and to my mother and to some of my aunts and uncles.
Do you have any of those letters?
I don't think so. I may have a few. I had an aunt, Aunt Ernestine, who passed away 8 or 10 years ago, and I believe her children located a handful of letters that I had written her and her husband, and I think I have them somewhere. So I'll have to dig for them. I know I have them somewhere, so I just got to dig for them.
What was the food like? What did you eat?
The food was very good.
Did they have a dining hall, 3 meals a day?
Such as it was. Again, you're in a field situation, so while we weren't always in a combat situation, it was not saucers and plates and china and silverware. We had metal trays, is my recollection, because they were very durable and very easy to clean and sterilize. But the food was good. The cooks, when you were not on C rations, when you were not out in the field and you weren't on the C rations, the food at base camp was very good. We had some extraordinarily good chefs. And I'm told that World War II was the same, because when I got home, I talked with some people of the next generation that had served in World War II, and they all said, the food was great. When we were not in a combat situation, food was excellent.
Did you always have enough supplies, clothing, other things that you needed, or were there any shortages?
No, we always had what we needed, and you learned early on to take care of yourself. So whenever you had an opportunity to scavenge something, you did. And you always stocked up, but we were always well stocked, and the 9th Infantry Division was a good division. They were noted for taking care of their troops, and they always had adequate supplies, adequate weapons, adequate ammunition. We always had extra socks. That socks are important because you were always in the water. You're in the Delta. You're in the water and in the rice paddies. And you would get trench foot. So I always had 3 or 4 pairs of socks, and you carried them, kept them dry above all else. That and your ammo.
How did you handle the stress?
I didn't think I really had any stress. Now, I've always felt that way. When I came home, I worked at a small bank, and actually was president of the bank for several years. And people always ask me how I handled stress, and I would say, gee, I don't think I have any stress. So I guess I'm one of those people, I don't get really too excited about anything. I don't ever really get mad. I just compromise and deal with the situation that presents itself when it presents itself. And I never felt that I was under any stress. I was scared a lot. Now maybe, you could say that that's a form of stress. But again, we were trained properly. I listened carefully in every bit of training that I underwent. So it becomes a reflex action, especially when you're in a combat situation. It becomes a reflex action. One of the dangers in being in the field in Vietnam was the booby traps and the mines. And I mean, there were booby traps in trees. I mean, it was just a crazy, crazy war. And it was a very nasty war, in a very somewhat backwards. I mean, there were booby traps with pointed sticks. And, you know, you stepped on something, they'd come down on you or whatever. I mean, it was just a crazy, crazy situation. And sadly, there were a lot of booby traps, a lot of landmines, and they were very cleverly concealed, and you didn't see them. And if you stepped on one, you were gone. That was it. So it was a different war from that respect. Much different, I guess, from World War I and World War II. But there was an awful lot of that in Vietnam.
Did you do anything special for good luck?
No, not that I recall. It was just common sense. My good luck was being alert. I was in Saigon during the Tet Offensive, and I had that M16 with me locked and loaded the whole time. I mean, no matter where I was prepared. Fortunately, I never had to use it. But, I mean, you just had to be prepared. And one thing that was unusual about the Vietnam War, you didn't know the South Vietnamese from the North Vietnamese from the Viet Cong. When you were in a urban or even a rural area, many times the Viet Cong were there with you and you didn't know them. So you had to be extremely cautious. Now the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, they were different. They had uniforms. You know pretty much who they were. But frequently in the Delta, when we would be in any of the smaller cities in a rural setting, we were told to be cautious because the Viet Cong had infiltrated and they were there, and you wouldn't always see them until they did something. So it was very, very unusual in that case. It wasn't, you know, like World War II, where you knew where your enemy was and you knew what they were doing.
You said you always carried your M16. What's your opinion of the M16?
It's a great, great rifle. It was very forgiving. If you kept it clean, that thing never let you down. I never had, now I wasn't an infantryman, so I didn't use it a lot, but I never had the thing jam. Again, I kept it clean. I could field strip that thing very quickly, but you kept it oiled, and as long as it was clean and it didn't get rusty, that was golden. And it was very light. You could carry that thing all day long and not even know you're carrying it. Much different from the M14 that we trained with. They're very heavy, very cumbersome, and they would jam very easily.
What did you do for entertainment?
There wasn't much. You would go to the non-commissioned officers club, and they had what they called 3.2 beer, and you'd have beer with your buddies. There would be movies occasionally, not always, but occasionally. Again, we were Bearcat was right out there in the field, so we were just the perimeter away from a combat situation. So you were always on the alert. Every night you had mortar attacks. Every night mortar was coming into the compound, and some areas
And that wasn't stressful?
You just live with it. We worked hard to ensure that we were in as safe an environment as we could be in. We had sandbags. Usually under the sandbags was armor. So unless you got a direct hit, you were going to be all right. If something hit over here and you're here, there'll be a non-event. And unless the base got overrun or your corner of the base got overrun, you were fine.
Did you ever have any USO shows out at that base?
Yes. It was very interesting because I had been in country we gotten out, we landed in Benoit. I had the deal with the attempted overrun of the airfield, and then we got out to Bearcat, and 3 weeks. I was there 3 weeks, and Bob Hope appeared one day with Raquel Welch. Never forget that as long as I live. And they put on quite a show, and of course the men went wild, especially the ones that had been there 9, 10, 11 months, because Raquel Welch, at the time, miniskirts were in, and she came out, and she was a very nice looking young lady, and she was in her miniskirt, and she was dancing around, and she actually came out and was shaking hands, as was Bob Hope, with some of the Army folks, and talking. They were two genuine people. They really wanted to be there doing what they were doing, and they knew what was good for morale. And I have vivid memories of seeing them right in my mind today. Very nice show. She sang and performed a number of songs that were hits at the time, and it was a very nice show.
Did you ever get to go on leave?
I did, but once I went on leave for a week. I went to Penang, Malaysia. I'm not sure why I went there, other than the photos that we saw looked better than any of the photos anywhere else. And we couldn't just go anywhere. So that we had a choice of maybe 6 locations. I couldn't come home. I would have loved to have gone to Australia, but Australia was not available. My recollection was that it was mostly countries similar to Vietnam in close proximity that were available.
So what'd you do on your 1 week?
There wasn't, what are you going to do? There isn't much you could do. You try to do a little sightseeing. I went with 2 friends. 3 of us were able to go together. That didn't always happen. Frequently you went off on your own. But the 3 of us went together, and I remember doing some sightseeing. We did some gambling, normal, relaxing. We did get to the beach, and then we were able to do some swimming. It was good to be in a non-combat situation, good to not have to look over your shoulder worrying about Viet Cong coming or whatever. And it was too short, but again, it was better than nothing, and I was thankful to get 5 days away.
What did you think of your fellow officers?
Many of them were excellent. They had what the enlisted men called the 90-day wonders. And that term actually came from World War II, when folks were drafted, and if they had sufficient aptitude, they were selected for officers training, and they went through officers training, and in 90 days they were commissioned second lieutenants. During the Vietnam conflict, it was a longer indoctrination, and you did not get drafted and be selected for officers candidate school. If you were drafted, you either enlisted for 3 years or as an enlisted man, or you enlisted if you qualified for officers training, and that was a 4-year commitment. So many people that were drafted wouldn't do that. For instance, I wouldn't even think. I was drafted, I was willing to do my duty for 2 years. I didn't care what I did. I would do it to the best of my ability, and I told them that, and I had no desire to stay in longer than 2 years. I qualified to do other things, and I would have loved to gone to that training, but when I inquired, fortunately I asked, is it 2 years? And in every case, I had to sign up for 3 years, or for warrant officer training and qualifications, it was 4 years. And I just wouldn't do it. I said, you got me for 2 years, and that's what I'm going to do. They would try scare tactics. They would say, oh, you should take advantage of this, because if you get this training, you'll be able to go to Germany, or you'll be able to go somewhere else, and you won't go to Vietnam. And if otherwise you're just going to go, you're going to be a grunt, and you're going to go over to Vietnam, you're going to get killed. And I said, well, if that happens, it happens. I'm not signing up for more than 2 years. So that was my mentality. But many of my friends signed up for an additional year, and they were enlisted men, and they went off and they became cooks and radio operators, armor specialists, and whatever interested them they qualified for. The qualification process was very stringent. I don't recall who made the decisions, but for 3 or 4 or 5 days after we were drafted, we did nothing but take aptitude tests. And not only were there intense physical qualifications that you either achieved or you didn't, but they tested your IQ and your aptitude for various things. For instance, are you mechanically, are you able to fly, those sorts of things. We never saw the data, but it was realistic. I'm convinced it was realistic and accurate. And because they came back to me and said, you have a strong mechanical aptitude, and I did. So I got to believe that it was accurate. But again, it depended on who you were as to what you did. And I just had that mentality, 2 years, and then I'm home and on with my life. And I'm a very optimistic person. The glass is always half full with me. So the fact that I could die, that really, I never accepted that, because I was not going to die. That wasn't the way I was thinking. I was taught to survive. I was going to survive. That was what kept me going, I think. I felt I possessed a reasonable degree of common sense. I felt that I had good friends, good soldiers who'd gone through similar training to me, that had my back in a combat situation. And you have the training, and it becomes a reflex action in a combat situation.
Now, you stayed at Bearcat until your last day in Vietnam?
Yeah.
Do you recall your last day in Vietnam?
Yes. When you became a short timer, which was 30 days, you got your orders, and I knew that I had November 28th, 1968 was my last day in the Army, and then I would be required to do 4 years of inactive reserve. So I knew that. I had a calendar that I carried in my wallet, and I marked off every day. So I knew exactly what was going on and where I had to be and so on. And like clockwork, 30 days before your discharge date, you met with the company commander and a re-enlistment specialist. And they asked you if you wanted to re-enlist. And they told you, again, based on your testing, that you qualified for this, that, or the other thing. And if you re-enlisted, if you weren't happy in the MOS you were at, you could go to school, and they would train you in the MOS that you wanted, and so on. And in my particular case, they offered me they did not offer me any additional training at the time. They said, you've done a great job. You're a graduate of the Non-Commissioned Officers Academy. You're an E5. You'll be made an E6 if you re-enlist, and you'll get a $10,000 cash bonus if you re-enlist. And I remember it just like it was yesterday. I said, I appreciate the opportunity very much. Thank you. You can't pay me enough to re-enlist. That was my thinking. That was my attitude, and I was very direct with it. And that was it. in my case, whoever was doing the interviewing knew. I'm sure they have all that data in your file, so they knew that I had turned down other opportunities. And so they said, okay, thank you for your service. And you'll be going home probably in 3 weeks. It takes about a week because you're going to be flying into Oakland in California, and then we've got to get you to Hartford, and that's going to take some time, and so on and so forth. So I left. It's somewhere in that paperwork I'm giving you. It tells you, but I think my recollection is I left Bearcat November 15th or 16th, and then we went to a processing center. I don't recall where that was. It may have been in Saigon. And I was there a couple of days. And then we mustered out and got into Oakland. And that was an experience.
How long were you immediately discharged from Oakland?
Yes. Yeah.
And how did you get home from Oakland?
Commercial aircraft. It was a very unusual opportunity. I shouldn't say opportunity. It was an unusual situation, and I don't know if it was just me, but I did not realize how much hatred there was in America for the Vietnam conflict at the time, and I had no warning from the United States Army that many of the Americans were against the Vietnam War. We fly into Oakland and we're officially discharged, and we received some paperwork. I was asked if I wanted a Class 1 dress uniform, which is the dark green formal uniform, and I said no. I had a khaki uniform that I think they call it a second class uniform, but you wear that in hot conditions. And although it was November, why the devil am I going to get another uniform? It didn't make any sense to me. So I said, look, I am fine with the khaki uniform that I have. Just get me out of here. By the way, I still wear that khaki uniform in the parades on Memorial Day here. I still fit into it. But at any rate, it gave us some paperwork, and I'm walking through the airport in Oakland to get my commercial flight, and I got people spitting at me. And other folks that were with me, they were spitting at me and calling us baby killers, and it was the most bizarre situation I had ever seen. I had not witnessed that before. I had not read about it before. I didn't know anything about it.
What were you thinking?
I was thinking, what in the devil's going on? What is all of this? And I had no indication from letters from home that there was this problem. Now, we didn't have TV to be looking at Channel 3 News at the time where I was. So I never saw any of that stuff, and I was not aware of it. Folks that I was corresponding with never alerted me to that situation. So that was a shock. That was a real shock to me. And then I remember getting to my gate and saying something to the girl that was letting me onto the plane, and she said, and there were 3 or 4 others with me. I wasn't walking in alone. There were 3 or 4 others that we were going to the same place. We were going to Hartford, so we were going to the same thing, to Terma. So we all experienced the same thing. None of us was aware of the hatred that was with some people at the time. And she said, I'm surprised they didn't give you street clothes, because other folks that have been discharged were given street clothes because of the viralness that's around. And I don't know why they didn't do that. So she was aware, and she said in the past, people coming in from Vietnam, going through Oakland, have been given street clothes before they're given the option to get street clothes before they went to the terminal to fly home. So that was an experience. That was the saddest experience of my military career.
What was your homecoming like once you got back to Connecticut?
Oh, it was great. Again, we're coming to a small town. Everybody knows everybody, and my mother was a proud mother. My father had died prematurely when I was 13 years old, so she was a widow and never remarried. And we were family was very close, both my father's side of the family and mother's side of the family. And they, my mother had a big party for me, and my girlfriend was waiting for me. We were engaged before I left for Vietnam. She waited for me, and we're married today. We had 3 children, 5 wonderful grandchildren.
So once you got out, you were officially discharged. You said you had to do 4 years in the reserve?
Yes, inactive reserves. And they emphasized that it was inactive. We would not be called up unless there was a severe conflict or world war.
Did you have any commitment that you had to do any training?
Absolutely nothing. They would correspond with me, though, once a year, and just send me something that says you've completed 1 year of your inactive reserves. You have 3 years left, 2 years left, 1 year left. And then I finally got a notice that says your inactive reserve is over, and they sent a discharge. And I gave you that. That's framed there.
What did you do in the days and weeks immediately following your discharge?
I took it easy for the most part. Our combat pay was $300 a month, and I saved the $3,600 every month. Again, back then you couldn't wire money or anything. I bought a money order at the PX every month, and I sent it home to my mother with instructions to put it in the bank for me. So when I got home, I had $3,600. Most important thing in my life at that point, next to my girlfriend, was buying a new car. I never owned a new car. I never bought a new car. And I always paid cash for everything that I did back then. So I wanted to buy a Shelby Mustang in the worst way. And the only problem was a new Shelby Mustang was $4,500. I only had $3,600, and I was not borrowing any money to buy a new car. So I went down to New Britain, Connecticut, and I bought a brand new Pontiac GTO. I ordered it just the way I wanted it, the color I wanted, the options I wanted, and I paid $3,260 for it. So I had money left over, and I had a brand new car. And I just, we did a lot of reminiscing and partying with my high school and college buddies. Met with all of my family members, pretty much family by family, and told them about things, and they had a lot of questions and so on. And then I took about a month taking it easy, and then I decided to I needed to do something. I needed to get a job. So I went to work at Becton Dickinson in Canaan. And I was a forklift operator and materials handler. And I decided that I was going to go back to college. I'd gone to the University of Connecticut for a couple of years before being drafted, and I decided I was going to go back. And I decided I wanted to get an accounting. I wanted to have accounting credentials because I thought that that would be helpful to get me into some sort of a career for the rest of my life. When I was at the University of Connecticut, I was in the College of Agriculture with a minor in accounting. And I had decided while I was in Vietnam that agriculture in the northwest corner was not going to be a viable way to raise and support a family. Even though on my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family, there was a history of dairy farming, and both families owned their own farms. I decided that I was not going to be a dairy farmer the rest of my life. I didn't think I could make a living doing it. That was the only. I liked it. I enjoyed being outdoors. I loved the machinery. I loved the animals, but I just didn't think I could make a living doing it. So I ended up going to the Hartford Institute of Accounting in Hartford on the GI Bill. That was a very valuable benefit, being an Army veteran. So I went to the Hartford Institute of Accounting. It was a 2-year program, and graduated well up in my class. And I decided, again, during all of that training, that I wanted to work in a bank. My wife worked in a community bank, and a friend of mine, Tuck Cunningham, who was a World War II Army veteran, worked in the local bank, Litchfield County National Bank, and I had spoken with him, and he said, God, it's a great career. You see people you know every day, and you're doing good things, loaning money and giving back to the community. So that really appealed to me at the time. So upon graduation, I worked up a resume. I was real proud of that resume. I had all my accomplishments on there and my training and education. And I ended up sending that resume to about 50 community banks in the state of Connecticut. I got one response. And that was from a local bank. Actually, I got 2 responses. One from Canaan National Bank and one from Salisbury Bank and Trust Company. And I ended up going to work at Salisbury Bank and Trust Company, even though that was not my hometown. I was from Canaan. I had gone in to see the president of the Canaan Bank at the time, and it was a small bank. It was at the time, about 15 million in assets, and it was a good community bank, well managed, well run. And I went in and spoke with the president, and handed him my resume, and he looked at it and he said, John, I'm pleased that you're interested in working here at the bank, but I don't need to hire anybody. I don't have any opportunities for you. There's no room at the inn. And I said, well, far be it from me to suggest anything, but don't you look at a succession plan? I said, you're in your 60s. How long are you going to work? I'll be here forever. There's no need. I got a Charlie Jock is my protege. He's going to take over the bank when I leave. And I said, I'm not looking to take over the bank. I'm just looking for a job. He said, John, I told you, we don't have any openings. There's no opportunities here, even for a local boy. I'm sorry. So I said, okay. So my wife, who worked at Litchfield County, well, by then it was Colonial Bank and Trust, because Litchfield County sold the bank to Colonial. She worked there, and she worked with Tuck Cunningham at the bank. And when Litchfield County was sold to Colonial, he left Colonial and went to Salisbury Bank. And Margaret Hain, who was a good friend of my wife's and worked at Colonial Bank, said to Shirley, why don't you suggest to John that he go into Salisbury Bank and talk with Jack Rogers, the president and CEO. And so she did. She came home and she said, why don't you do that? So next morning I go in to see Jack Rogers. So I fill out an application. And on the application it says, who in the bank do you know? So I put down Tuck Cunningham. You're the only one I knew in the bank. So I finished the application and knocked on the door to his office and went in to see him. And much different reception than I had gotten at the Canaan National Bank. And he said, John, you have a very impressive resume. I see you've got an accounting background, and that's very important for successful bankers. I'm not going to be around here forever. We've just hired Tuck Cunningham. And he says, you don't know this yet, but we're getting ready to hire Margaret Hain, away from Colonial Bank. And, we're going to build this bank, and we're looking to the future, and we're going to be a strong community bank for years to come. I don't have any openings for you, but I would like to keep your resume on file in the event that I do have an opening somewhere down the line. And I can't make you any promises. We might not have an opening for 5 years, but I can promise you this. The next opening that I get, I'll call you. So that was, I came home in 69, so 68. I came home in 68. So that would have been in 69, spring of 69 probably. I ended up going to work at Salisbury Bank on May 23rd, 1973. And I had the privilege of working through every department in the bank. It was a small community bank. It was about $15 million in assets when I went there. And I believe there was 12 employees. And I was in the right place at the right time with the right mindset. And people were coming and going at the right time, which enabled me to step up every once in a while. And I started out as a entry-level trainee, and I ended up going through every department of the bank, working in every department of the bank, being promoted throughout a 36-year career at the bank, and I ended up being chairman of the board and chief executive officer of the bank for several years. I retired from the bank as an employee in June of 2009. I've been on the board of the bank since 1985, and I'm still a very active member of the board of directors today. When I left the bank in June of 2009, we were $550 million in assets. We had 135 employees in several branch offices in the surrounding towns. By the way, we bought the Canaan National Bank in 2004. So it's part of our team today. And I'm very proud of the bank and its employees and its board members today.
Wow. John, did you stay in touch with any of your buddies from Vietnam?
Not really. My closest two buddies were Jerry Roberts and Jimmy Navolo, as I told you earlier. Jerry sadly was killed. He was a straight leg infantryman. He, like me, was not going to enlist for more. He was 2 years out. Was it? Take me, whatever. I'll do whatever I need to do, but I'm not doing anything more. And sadly, he was killed. He received several Purple Hearts. And his name is on the monument in Washington. And I did keep in touch with his family. When I got home, I went to see his mother and father because we were just very close in basic training and AIT. And my next closest friend was Jimmy Navolo. Like me, he went through the Army and through the Vietnam War unscathed. And he came home to Torrington. And he is in Torrington today. He had no emotional or no physical scars, and he worked for the Torrington Police Department and is now retired from that position. And I do see him occasionally. Sadly, it's when someone that we know passes away or a friend of ours that we knew in the Army has passed away. He did call me when my mom passed away, and I called him and actually went to see him when there was a death in his family, but I haven't talked to him now in 5 or 6 years. I must get in touch with him, and this will be a catalyst for me to call him up or stop in and see him because I know where he lives, and we'll hook up again. But no, sadly, I was never able to locate Joe Volkevich. Maybe I'll perform additional due diligence and see if I can track him or his family down. Sadly, though, that's life, you know. I went through high school and I had a lot of friends in high school. I kept up with a lot of those friends. I don't know why, I just did. I guess it's the age that you were in when you have those memories. I went to college. I went to the University of Connecticut, the Hartford Institute of Accounting. I didn't keep up with any of my friends in college. I don't know why. It's just the experience.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yes. When I came home, I was approached by all of the local veterans organizations, and I became a life member of the VFW post in Canaan. Hodder Zuko was the company commander, the post commander at the time, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. He came to the house. He said, "John, here's the application. Sign it. I'll fill it out. You're a member." That was all there was to it. And I still participate in events there today. I also, when I moved to Sharon, I became a member of the American Legion Post 126, the Herbert Cleaves Post 126. Herbert Cleaves was a World War II veteran. And I'm a member of that post today. And I participate in most all of their events. And it is rare that I am not available and don't march in the Memorial Day Parade here locally. It's a very important event for our family because of my experience during the Vietnam conflict, and it's understood in our family. All the kids come to the parade, all the grandkids come to the parade. That's just understood. We just do that, and it's important to remember the veterans, because we at the time we didn't maybe realize it entirely, but we fought for America. We fought for America's freedoms. And it was the right thing to do. I don't regret a day that I spent in the U.S. Army. There were some trying days, including the day of my discharge, but in the end, it was all worth it.
John, how would you say that your military service affected your life?
Oh, it matured me. I spent my 21st birthday in a combat situation in a rice paddy in South Vietnam. I remember it well. I was 21 years old and I had water up to my waist. It matured me. It prepared me for life. I came home. I was focused. I was focused on getting married and starting a family and living in a rural environment and having fun. That's what I was focused on. I was thankful for the experience. I had no regrets. I wasn't looking for the experience. It came my way. My nature, my parents taught me to compromise very early in life. That was reinforced on the court hall steps in Torrington the day I was drafted. Further reinforced when we took the oath in New Haven, and when I went through the combat training for Vietnam. That's when I said to myself, "You're going to be fine because you got good common sense and you can compromise." So the U.S. Army and the experience with the Vietnam conflict had a profound effect on my life because it matured me early, and I was prepared. I was prepared to make intelligent decisions, and I think I've made fairly good decisions the rest of my life.
Well, John, I'd like to thank you for your service and thank you for this interview.
No, you're very welcome.